Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a seriously fascinating and honestly super controversial piece of medical history. We're looking at a text that basically took the established science of its day, looked it right in the eye, and totally flipped it on its head. We'll be objectively unpacking the core arguments that sparked a massive, industry-wide debate in early 20th century ophthalmology.
So let's dive right in. The man at the absolute center of this storm was Dr. William H. Bates. Back in the early 1900s, Dr. Bates, who was a highly experienced ophthalmologist by the way, published this seminal, incredibly debated book called The Bates Method for Better Eyesight Without Glasses. And in it, he directly challenged decades of established medical consensus about how the human eye actually works.
Now, because the medical claims he made were so completely radical, it's really important to understand just how polarizing this book was right from the get-go. Actually, even modern reprintings of this book slap a clear disclaimer right on the front page. It explicitly states that the seller makes no representation that the book reflects any opinion other than the author's. They're actively distancing themselves from the medical advice. And that's exactly our approach today, too. We aren't here to endorse this or debunk it. Our job is simply to report on Dr. Bates' arguments exactly as he laid them out, giving us a pretty incredible window into a major historical paradigm shift.
To make sense of all this, here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the eyesight crisis. Then, the orthodox medical view. After that, questioning the consensus, followed by the retinoscope revelation, and finally, a radical new theory.
Starting off with Part 1, the eyesight crisis, and what we might call an evolutionary mismatch.
Bates argued that human eyesight was essentially suffering from a massive evolutionary mismatch. Think about it. For literally eons, primitive humans used their eyes primarily for looking at things far away, right? Hunting, farming, scanning the horizon. Bates claimed this kind of distant sight was perfectly passive. It required basically zero muscular effort. But then, modern civilization happened. Almost overnight, evolutionarily speaking, we forced everyone into schools, we introduced endless columns of tiny, badly printed newspaper text, and we invented artificial lighting that kept us working long into the night. It's the exact same strain we feel today staring at our phones and computer screens all day. According to Bates, nature just never designed the eye for this relentless close-up strain. And he believed this led to an absolute crisis where something like 9 out of 10 civilized adults ended up with imperfect sight.
Moving to Part 2. The orthodox medical view. This is the brick wall Bates ran straight into.
To really understand why Bates was considered so revolutionary, we have to look at the scientific consensus of his time. At the absolute heart of this entire debate is a biological mechanism called accommodation. Simply put, accommodation is just how your eye adjusts its focus to see objects clearly at different distances. Like how you shift from reading a text message right in front of your face to instantly focusing on a mountain miles away.
Now, the orthodox medical establishment, which, remember, Bates himself was initially trained in, believed a few very strict, unbreakable rules about accommodation. They taught that the inner lens of the eye changes its curvature to create that focus. They also firmly believed that the overall shape of your eyeball itself is completely permanent. So because of that, if you had poor eyesight, a refractive error, it was viewed as an incurable organic defect. Under this really rigid view, glasses couldn't actually cure anything. They were thought of merely as optical crutches for an inherently broken organ.
To get a bit more specific, this orthodox view blamed bad eyesight on permanent physical deformations of the eyeball. If you had hypermetropia, which is farsightedness, the medical consensus said your eyeball was literally just physically too short from front to back, causing light to focus behind the retina. And on the flip side, if you had myopia, nearsightedness, they said your eyeball was permanently too long, meaning the light focused before it even reached the retina.
Which brings us to Part 3, questioning the consensus, and the weird anomalies Bates kept finding in his clinic.
Over a 30-year career examining tens of thousands of eyes, Bates started to notice that reality just wasn't matching up with the medical textbooks. He documented an incredible number of medical anomalies that actively, directly contradicted this whole idea of permanent, incurable eyeball shapes. For instance, he saw patients who would spontaneously recover their vision out of nowhere. He saw refractive errors change form completely unpredictably. I mean, someone would be nearsighted one day and farsighted another. That absolutely shouldn't be possible if the eyeball shape is a rigid, permanent structure. The medical establishment tried to explain these anomalies away by blaming the ciliary muscle inside the eye, often using atropine drops to paralyze it. But Bates found those explanations totally inadequate. For him, if a scientific rule had this many exceptions, it just wasn't a scientific truth. So, Part 4, the retinoscope revelation. Let's look at the objective measurement that changed everything.
Driven by all these glaring contradictions, Bates turned to a tool that would ultimately provide his massive breakthrough. Traditionally, eye doctors used the Snellen test card, the famous chart with the giant E at the top. But Bates found this to be way too subjective. It took a long time, the patient had to sit perfectly still, and honestly, they often just got confused or guessed the letters. So instead, Bates leaned heavily on a device called a retinoscope. The retinoscope is entirely objective and virtually instantaneous. But the biggest game changer, it could be used from a distance while the subject was actively moving around, and it didn't rely on the patient's spoken feedback at all.
Here is exactly how it worked. The doctor shines a beam of light from a little mirror into the subject's pupil, and then they observe the shadow that bounces back from the retina. If the doctor moves the mirror and the shadow moves in the opposite direction, it instantly tells them the eye is myopic right at that exact split second. If the shadow moves in the same direction, the eye is normal or hypermetropic. It's essentially a real-time, physical measurement of refraction. Because this tool was so incredibly fast and objective, Bates completely broke out of the clinic. He took the retinoscope out into the real world, and the versatility he recorded in his experiments is honestly mind-blowing. He literally measured the eyesight of professional baseball players mid-swing. He wanted to see exactly how the refraction changed the moment the bat hit the ball. He measured the eyes of cats, dogs, birds, even fish swimming in water. He measured people who were fast asleep or totally unconscious under ether anesthesia. And what he discovered through all these extreme, varied conditions was that the eye's refraction is constantly fluctuating based on movement, lighting, and even mental state. It is absolutely never static.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, a radical new theory.
All of this highly dynamic retinoscope data brought Dr. Bates to a climax that turned his entire field upside down. He concluded that the orthodox theory was totally wrong. He proved to himself that the inner lens is not the primary factor in accommodation. So he posed the absolutely critical question: if the inner lens isn't doing the focusing, what exactly is?
His answer to that question became his famous camera analogy. Bates stated that the eye focuses precisely like a camera. It doesn't focus by changing the shape of the inner lens. Instead, it focuses by physically changing the overall length of the eyeball itself. And how does it change length? Through the action of the extraocular muscles. Those are the muscles situated on the very outside of the eyeball. When you look at something up close, Bates argued that these outer muscles physically squeeze the eyeball, lengthening it exactly like a camera lens extending outward to focus on a nearby object.
So, the crucial takeaway here is this absolute paradigm shift. Bates boldly declared that poor eyesight is not an incurable, rigid physical deformity. Because the outer muscles control the shape of the eye, refractive errors are simply functional derangements. It's just muscle strain. Myopia is caused by the strain to see distant objects, locking the eye in an elongated state. Hypermetropia is the strain to see near objects, and the most radical, earth-shattering claim of all, because bad eyesight is just muscular and functional strain, it can actually be treated, improved, and entirely eliminated without ever needing a pair of glasses. Now, Dr. Bates fully knew he was contradicting a century of undisputed medical teaching, but he ultimately trusted his own observations over the textbooks. Whether you view him as a brilliant visionary pioneer or a totally misguided outlier, his story forces us to ask a really compelling question. How much of our modern medical understanding is built on unquestioned traditions? It's a powerful reminder to always stay curious, to look really closely at the data, and to never, ever be afraid to challenge the consensus. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.